I took off from my grass airfield and I had done one go around, came in low, and then I was going around again, and my engine started acting up on me and finally quit. And when I crashed, it just kind of obliterated the memory of pretty much that day. There was no tunnel. I was more like just teleported somewhere, and there was work I had to do. It was very interactive. So I just remember like literally appearing, and I was on the terrace of a tall building in a post-apocalyptic looking city. And I said, what's happening now? Basically. And it said, well, each gear is the probability, not the certainty, but a probability of a thought, word, or action in your future. So
I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of The Soul Inspired. Today we have Jim Bruton with us. He has had a near-death experience, and possibly we'll see what other experiences or situations he's had in his life, but I really appreciate coming on today, Jim, and being on the show.
Hi, Joe. Nice to be with you. Thank you.
I always when I'm having conversations with everyone, I don't know why this is just a big integral part of the way that I speak with people, but I like to go back to people's childhoods a little bit to start and just get a little bit about who you were.
Sure. It's actually an interesting take on things because I can relate to it 100%. My life was one or has been one of realizing childhood dreams. I grew up in the 60s, when President Kennedy said, we're going to the moon by the end of the decade. Well, that got all kinds of little kids with big imaginations fired up. The Popular Mechanics magazine would come every week promising the jet pack we would fly to school with, or the flying saucer in our garage we would fly to work, or moon tourism by the year 2000. All these really utopian views of the future and how all this technology was going to give us so much more time back in our lives. Yeah, that works out. But so as a result, the things I was interested in as a child, uh, well, I loved science fiction. Like I said, we're going to the moon. Science fiction was kind of almost justified at that point. It was almost like doing homework. So I loved the idea of a future where everybody treats each other nicely. The Vietnam War is going on and just all this other stuff. So, and of course, with the interest in science fiction at that age, you're really interested in the technology as well. So I knew I wanted to maybe invent something that was futuristic.
Hmm.
And I did, and I'll come back to that in a second. I'm just going through the list. So interested in science fiction, futuristic living, cool technology. And the other thing is I love to watch programs on television that were about wildlife. And we had this one popular one called Wild Kingdom. I watched it every Sunday night religiously before the Disney hour came on.
Mm.
And I remember sitting there just watching TV, in a black and white TV on the kitchen table, saying, how do I do that for a living? Okay, let me go to another one. In the 60s, my father learned how to fly, small aircraft. And so I, in my own way, fell in love with aviation, but I really liked old aviation, like right after the Wright brothers, and I'd say through World War One. So let's say probably 1910 to 1917. That was just my specific interest in aircraft.
Mm.
Okay. Well, with regards to wildlife filming, I do have an Emmy for my work with National Geographic Television because I lived in Africa off and on for 14 years and made wildlife films, had my own safari business, and so on. And then, as far as science fiction, while I was in Africa, 300 miles from anyone in the world's oldest desert on the southwestern coast, I saw a Disney film crew. They were scouting a location. We were all in the middle of nowhere, but they had a satellite telephone, which at that time was a nickelized polyester foldable satellite dish,
Hmm.
a bunch of cases, and a handset. And I thought, wow, we're so remotely situated. And look, instant communication back to their studios. And I asked them, has anybody ever pushed video through that? And they said, we don't know. I said, well, I'm going to figure out how to do it. And I was the first person in the world to figure out how to do it. So it was like taking a TV satellite truck and shrinking it into a backpack. So that's kind of a futuristic thing. So I got to
Wow.
invent my thing for the future, and it really did change the way in which news could be broadcast from all over the world, from harsh, remote, and extreme locations. And to prove it, I went to all seven continents. I was on the Titanic expedition for Discovery Channel, North Pole, Mount Everest several times, and then a bunch of war zones. So we were able, or I was able to go live with video from places that were impossible before. And then, as far as airplanes, like I said, I fell in love with early aviation when I was a kid and just draw picture after picture. And then when I retired from the war business, my new wife said, "Well, now that you're not traveling all over the world and having that high testosterone life and trying to settle down, why don't you build that airplane you're always talking about?" So I did. And that was a reproduction World War One aircraft, just like the Red Baron flew with the three wings, except I had my own original paint scheme, which were black and white stripes. But I did build it and I did fly it because I am a pilot. And so, like I said, I really got to realize all these dreams I had in the 60s as a
Wow.
child. An overactive imagination and not taking no, for an answer was a real big part of that. And then I think the fourth thing was I was also very curious about God. I was a lonely kid because I didn't have any brothers and sisters, and I was, kind of ADHD, so I think I wore kids out. So I was by myself a lot. So I talked to God a lot, I guess. But I was always interested. And I think from a very early age, I realized that I would find more answers in spirituality than I would in religion. But in the late 60s, when you're 12 years old, you don't really have the vocabulary, and the culture did not have the vocabulary at the time. For instance, my parents one day got tired. When I was 12 years old, they said, "Enough with the questions about God. Put on your suit, walk past the five houses down to the Baptist church and ask your questions." I said, "Okay." So I went down there, and that wasn't going to work because, I show up and the preacher was getting ready for the service. So he didn't have any time for me. And then afterwards, everybody wanted his attention. I said, "I've got to figure this out." I came back the next week. Now, he'd been there for years, and his name was on the sign out front for years. But the weekend I choose to go there, the two weekends I choose to go there, that first weekend, he was there. The second weekend, he was nowhere to be found. And I asked the woman sitting next to me, "Where's Reverend Coolidge?" And she goes, "Oh, we got rid of him." Now, remember, this is 1969 in the South, in the
Mm,
United States. So you can imagine what the culture. Now, he was a full blooded Cherokee Indian. He looked like he came off a movie set. He was really handsome, big, chiseled features, long black hair. He just looked cool. He looked like I want to be that guy.
right.
He really looked like that kind of person. So anyway, what happened was his daughter was Rita Coolidge, who was a very prominent star rising singer in the 60s. She hung out with a lot of amazing male stars as well, but she was a star, is a star in her own right. And her slightly older sister, Priscilla, was married to Booker T. Jones of Booker T. and the MGs. Yeah, he's black. When she was like half Cherokee, half white. But because her father, the minister, married them, they threw him out of the church within a week.
Wow.
And I just looked at the lady because already at the age of 12, I knew, well, spirituality doesn't have anything to do with race or gender. This just sounds like a stupid reason. But I just looked straight ahead, which she probably took as righteous indignation. Anyway, I go home. I say, Mom, they threw out Reverend Coolidge. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you." I said, "Thanks." Because I had to sit through the whole service because I was trapped in the pew. But anyway, that memory 50 years later came back when I woke up in the hospital after my plane crash, which I'm jumping ahead and we can go back to that in a
Hmm.
second. But as I woke up, sort of came to, and my brain started to really work again, that memory came flooding back in along with the memory of my near death experience. And I was like, why is that memory coming in? And basically, the voice of my NDE, which I said we'll backtrack to in a second, was really telling me, said, back way back then, because you asked about what could be anchored in our childhood that leads to a natural evolutionary quantum leap in later on signified by an NDE.
Hmm.
And for me, that was God saying, It's almost like he's saying I delivered. Um, that he was glad that I had a lot of questions about him as a child.
Mm,
But that instance in the church, that moment I chose to go to church and realize this is not where I'm going to get my answers, he said, if you follow the ways of man, which is religion, you'll come out with more questions than you went in with. But I was telling you at that moment, if you choose instead to walk with me, we're going to color outside the lines. We're
mm.
going to go in so many places that you are told not to go, you that you don't go to. So we have a hand raised there. I'm sorry, I
Oh,
forgot.
that's okay. Yeah, I don't know why it does that sometimes.
I'll pick it up again. So, God was basically saying if you walk the ways of man, which is, religion, man creates religion, you're going to come out with more questions than you would end with. But if you walk with me, we're going to go to all sorts of places. We're going to color outside the lines. We're going to go where everybody's terrified of going. You can't go there to get your truth. Why? Well, because it's scary. Um, but if you really looked at my life and my adventures and my travels, you'd see he did deliver right up into and including my airplane crash, flying one of my vintage airplanes that resulted in my near death experience.
Mm.
And I just think it was kind of neat. He was saying, okay, remember that was a promise I was making you 50 years ago, and now I've delivered it. And now we're still walking together,
Hmm.
and one of the coolest things that he said to me from my near death experience at the end of it, because again, it was a plane crash, he said, now the man who fell from the sky is not the same who flew into it. And that much is true. And I have come to be so grateful for my airplane crash and everything that followed. It was the greatest gift I've ever been given.
Wow. What's really interesting is the next episode that's actually releasing on the show is about a woman who had a plane crash. I was just going through the editing and processing of it just today. So here we are now talking to another. It's just that's a very strange coincidence because there's not too many NDEs I talk to that are around plane crashes because planes don't, yes, they crash, but that's not as common as other things that we talk about
It's
with
not as
near-death
common to
experience.
talk to survivors either.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's
It's a
um
one-way trip usually.
absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. It gives me a little indication of who you were. So you were a seeker. You were a truth seeker of the higher powers of whatever it is, so I ask that because some people are indoctrinated, they're right away in a religion, they're right away in church, and sometimes that can really influence. Seems like you were given some choice from your parents to seek those answers yourself.
I think it's because they just threw up their hands, hopelessly saying there's no way we can answer these questions. And he
Mm,
keeps asking them. My father's mother was a minister in Unity. It's kind of a very liberal, open-minded, I guess, a Christian church,
right.
very open-minded. And so I was able to ask her a lot of my questions. And she would come visit once a year from California, and we were living in Florida at the time. So I really anxiously anticipated her visits and had all my questions and kept her up late at night just
Hmm.
asking her in rapid fire fashion all my
Right.
questions.
Right. So you're in the South, she's in California.
Yeah.
California's got the United kind of church kind of vibe going. I can
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of
The
sense it.
culturally couldn't have been more different than
Right.
this.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. So, okay, so let's lead up to what happened. We know what you were doing. I mean, it's amazing, the accolades and the things you've done. And it's interesting. As soon as you were talking, I was like, oh, it was coming online, all the reasons, I found your story interesting. How did this lead into this? So you'd built this plane,
Mhm.
and how did this kind of get to this point where the NDE happened?
Sure. Well, like I said, I built that really cool World War I plane and I sold it to an Air Force pilot. And then I said, okay, I need to build another plane. And I had another favorite plane from when I was young. And I thought, well, I built my macho airplane. Now I can build the one that looks like it comes out of a Disney cartoon. It's called a Flying Flea. It was really tiny. And it was from 1933 in France, and the designer Henri Meunier wanted to build a small plane that people could build on the dining room table of their Paris apartment. which is kind of funny. It
Wow.
was really the birth of ultralight aviation. So I did build it, and it was beautiful plane. And I was on my second test flight on October 6th, 2016, around 5 p.m. I took off from my grass airfield, and I had done one go around, came in low, and then I was going around again, and my engine started acting up on me and finally quit. I was able to get it started, and then it quit again. And I couldn't make it back to the grass airfield. And it was in Connecticut, in this Connecticut countryside. It was very hilly, it was very rocky, and it was very wooded. But there was a nearby Boy Scout camp that had a small lake. And since the shape of this particular aircraft was almost like a boat in the front, I thought, oh, I'll just go for the water and I'll just, belly it in, and it's open cockpit. I'll pop the belt and swim out. It's not a big deal. Um, but honestly, after I started my engine the second time and it then stopped, I have no memory at all. Meaning, when I crashed, it just kind of obliterated the memory of pretty much that day. And then later in the hospital, when I got my laptop computer, out of curiosity, I went back through my emails to see when the last email I remembered reading or writing was.
Hmm.
It was literally 2 days before my crash. So that's how much that's how many memories got knocked out of me with the
Wow.
crash. It's like 2 days before. Anyway, um, but I retraced to my path, if you will, to where I crashed, and I realized I had done exactly what I thought I should do, by where I crashed and how close I came to not crashing. I was really aiming for the lake, but I overshot the bank and then crashed into the forest and all the tree trunks at 70 miles an hour in the equivalent of a soapbox derby car. Luckily, there was a retired teacher and police officer fishing in this Boy Scout camp because in October it was closed. So he went there for the peace and quiet. So I kind of disturbed that. But luckily, as a police officer, he had seen trauma, certainly with, car crashes or heaven knows what else. So he didn't start freaking out when I was in the cockpit of this plane with both lungs burst. All my ribs were broken. My right leg looked like a pretzel. It was just, I had a stick sticking through my cheek, a piece of the wood aircraft. It was pretty bad. And he called 911, the emergency services, and they sent out a helicopter. And he just kept me propped up because, like I said, I had no real functioning lungs, so I was more gasping for air. So being in an upright position was probably better in case, there was any blood draining in or whatever. And so the helicopter flew me up to the Hartford, Connecticut Trauma Center where there was a waiting team, and they took me right in. And remember, what I'm telling you now is what I've heard. I wasn't, aware
Okay.
of it, but putting it all together. But I had one brief memory of escaping my restraints because when you're intubated with tubes going in down your throat and all over, it's very natural for people in their delirium to try to pull those tubes out. So that's why they restrain you. It's not because you're thrashing or you're violent. But I escaped my restraints, and I they re-restrained me. And then they told my wife at the time, when she finally got the news and arrived, that being a bit of a handful and also with a week's worth of 8 hour plus operations coming up where they could lose me at any time, it was better to just put me into a medically induced coma. So she agreed, and that's what they did. Now, if you just want a simple timeline that I can't be certain of, I could say that when the coma began here, so did the near death experience over on the
Yeah.
other side. It's really hard to say, but if we just use that as a general model, because it's really not that important, we can kind of go with the story. So, you know how a lot of near death experiences, um, people will like go through a tunnel,
Hmm.
they'll see deceased loved ones on the other side, they'll have a life review, and sometimes they'll get a big message and then they're sent back. If you think about it, it's a pretty passive experience.
Hmm.
Mine was not passive. There was no tunnel. I was more like just teleported somewhere, and there was work I had to do. It was very interactive. And um, So I just remember like literally appearing, like in a dream, when you have a dream, you don't realize you're about to dream. You just sort of wake up in the dream, doing stuff. But that's kind of how
Mhm.
this was. And I was on the terrace of a tall building in a post-apocalyptic looking city. Imagine Toronto or New York 1,000 years after the nuclear blast or when the asteroid hits or something like that. It's just totally, totally destroyed and no sign of life. And that's where I was. And above me were these huge, dark, dense storm clouds, like the mother of all storms was getting ready to cut loose. But I wasn't afraid. I just, was just taking it all in. And I remember just scanning the city and looking at the clouds. And then I felt this like a wave of nausea go through what I guess would be my stomach or something. And I remember doubling over with pain. And I said something in my head. I said, I don't know that I can stand this because it was pretty racking. And when I did that, I heard a sound off to my left over on this terrace. And I looked over, and not too far away was basically like a sculpture of an egg. An egg. However, the sculpture was made, the egg itself was made out of open lattice work, very a lot of open space. Like if you took metal bands and you just bent them around in all directions, but at the end of it, it's shaped kind of like an egg. All right.
Mhm.
And then as I looked through the open gaps to the interior, I could see these small specialized gears just sort of floating in air but moving around. These gears you call sector gears. When you think of a gear, you think of a circle with little teeth all the way around it. A sector gear is like a pie slice of that moves back and forth. That has a beginning, middle, and end to its motion, and that's significant in the story.
Okay.
I'd never seen one before. I'd never seen a sector gear. However, as I went over to it to look more closely, because I mean, obviously, it was the only interesting thing there. I mean, it's a dead city and the sky getting ready to cut loose with a storm. So, what am I going to do? So I go over there, and as I looked through it, and I saw those gears floating in the air. Whenever I looked at them, a video feed would play in my head of what they represented. And I realized with that beginning, middle, and end the motion they were designed for, these were events in my future. Why? Because I saw myself as older. Why? Because I saw my daughter one day with children of her own, which she still doesn't have. And so I said, okay, so these are events in my future. The reason they're shaped the way they are to have a beginning, middle, and end to their movement is because all events have a beginning, middle, and end. And so, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. So I was some were very definite and clear the gear, and some were very ghost-like, and they could just sort of pass through each other unimpeded. So I
Hmm.
put my hand through the open lattice work because I was just wanted to see if I could touch one. And this one just sort of appeared out of nowhere. And as it brushed by my hand, I was hit by another wave of nausea. And reflexively, I grabbed the gear, took it out through that open lattice work, and threw it over my shoulder. Why did I know I could do that? I don't know. But I did. And when I did, all of the gears started rapidly spinning around inside, basically accounting for the loss of one of those gears. And I said, okay. And so at some point I said, I sort of was saying it to myself, but this disembodied voice joined me and stayed with me through the whole thing. And I said, what's happening now, basically. And it said, well, each gear is the probability, not the certainty, but a probability of a thought, word, or action in your future. Your destiny, meaning the total collection of all these future choices, future moments.
Hmm.
That's your destiny, right? So your destiny is resetting itself around what you've removed. And I said, well, how did I know I could do that? Like pull that gear out and remove that future moment. And the voice literally said, well, why else are you here? I said, I have no idea. I don't even know what this place is. And it said, you're in the in between. And I said, in between what? And it said, everything, the impossible now between the past and the future. And I said, well, that makes no sense whatsoever. And I said, well, it's impossible in its short duration. Yet here you are standing in this side inside the eternity of a single moment. And then it said, do you remember the world to which your body belongs? And I really thought hard and I thought, no, I don't remember anything about where I've come from. And I said, I have no idea. And it said, then you see the truth and how the past is dust. Seriously, if somebody had come up to me at that moment, like you see in the movies, if you stay here any longer, you can't go back. I'd say, go back where?
Right.
To Earth. Well, what's Earth? To your family. What's a family? I was depersonalized
Hmm.
down to zero. I had no sense of a personality. I had, this is a big statement, so it is prone to error. I had no sense of an ego. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't anything. I was just a conscious, aware being. And just sort of taking it all in and ready to, continue to react to what was in front of me to do. And I said, well, why do some of these gears I touch not cause pain? And why do some cause pain? And it said, well, all choices, because they represent choices in your future, have unintended consequences, some unfortunate and some not. And the pain each brings you is your guide. And I said, well, where are the gears that feel good? And it said, well, you're not here to feel good. It wasn't a
Hmm.
threat. It was just, you're here to do some work.
Hmm.
So anyway, and then I saw another gear pass by. And in this gear, I saw my daughter one day with her own children at an amusement park. And as she put them into the teacup or the roller coaster or whatever, they were all like really excited and happy and laughing. And, uh, and that was one of those good gears, that was fine. And obviously I let that gear go by without removing it. But anyway, I continue to see the gears just kind of ebbing and flowing through my field of vision, and each had its own clear video or clear image of meaning. And so I realized that my opportunity here, with no better moral compass than pain, wasn't like I had a guru in mind. It wasn't like I had a mantra. It wasn't like I had a prayer. It literally was just the nauseating pain of the bad choices in my future. By reaching through the egg and just feeling around till I found a gear that hurt, and then I removed it. I mean, that, like I said, it's a shaming thing to say there was no better moral compass than pain, but when it's pain, there's no argument.
Hmm.
But anyway, I just did this over and over and over, and I realized this is why I'm here. And at one point, I saw this growing pile of gears behind me, and I said, wow, it looks like if I don't have a bad life, I have no life at all. Am I going to die sooner from doing all this? And the voice said, well, your destiny has to fit itself around futures that aren't meant to be. Your number of breaths are already counted. I will worry about your last one. And I said, well, I don't know how comforting that is. And I said, well, eliminating bad choices doesn't mean you won't make wrong ones. You can make a mistake and it's not a sin, right? It said you won't know they're wrong until after they pass. And since right or wrong are variables over which you have no control, the answers to what comes tomorrow are a waste. It's better to understand the beauty of the grand plan of how everything fits and refits together. Meaning, prophecy, who cares? That's just an
Hmm.
answer to a specific question. The understanding of how things work is much more important. And I said, well, what am I missing here in my lack of understanding? And it said, well, what is clearly before you? Grace. No one deserves salvation. It can only be given by grace. It's your birthright, but it must be chosen at the expense of the world that separates us, you and me. I said, well, kind of like I just said to you, I said to the voice, I said, this fixing my future is painful. And I feel ashamed that, I don't have some better moral compass. I'm only guided by pain. I said, I don't even know when or where these futures happen. I said, where or when are not important. Removing your enthusiasm to further chain yourself to the world isn't as painful as carrying the crushing weight of those chains once forged around you.
Hmm.
And then I said, this is kind of like one of those mouse mazes. It's designed that I can do one thing and one thing only with no chance to screw it up. And it says, well, and this is probably the most profound thing it said. It said, if those with choices make poor use of them, offering fewer possibilities could be called mercy.
Wow.
Said then it said you can't change the past. but you can make better choices in the future. Everything is interconnected, and pay more attention to your relationships. Be gentle with everyone as I'm gentle with you. And I said, what's gentle about all this? Because it's painful. And it said, well, you prayed for something for which being here is the answer. And that's when it said the parting words of, and now the man who fell, flew into the sky is not the same who fell from it. And that was it. Kicked me out. I came home.
Wow. Wow. And there was no tunnel way the way home? You just, is that when you woke?
It was interesting. It's almost like doing a zoom out on a lens, just sort of fading back, fading back, fading back. And then I was back. And it was weird because um, when I came out, according to my then wife and friends, when I came out of the coma, I was really loopy for about a week. And I have absolutely no memory of that time. So it was about a week after I came out of the coma that I was transferred from ICU over to the rehabilitation hospital. And it was there I had my first real cognizance and memories and thinking ability after, like I said, after I came out of the coma. So the most lucid experience I've ever had in my life, the most illuminating experience I've ever had, are bookended on each side by periods of amnesia. I find that interesting
Mm-hmm.
and unlikely.
Yeah.
But when I came to in the rehab hospital, it was like it's almost like just coming into focus. Like you've been there, but you weren't in focus, and all of a sudden you're in focus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as I looked around, I remember just kind of being in a pretty good mood. It was like, okay, here I am, and people are busy and they're in my room. I know I'm in a hospital, but here's the weird thing: how would I know I'm in a hospital? Why should I be in a hospital? I don't remember having a crash, but it was just like just chill to kind of surf that wave.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm supposed to be in a hospital now, so I'll just play the role of being a patient. And but what was wild was cycling through my mind right away, right away, right away was my near death experience. It was just cycling over and over and over again. And with each iteration, there was more like of an emotional impact, more penetrating insight, right down to the fractal degree, the internal logic of it all. And I was like, whoa, what's this all about? But I just let it cycle through. It's not like I'm trying to stop it or that I even could. But I could feel it almost creating a pressure inside me to talk about it. You know how a lot of people say, "Oh, I didn't talk about my NDE for years because I was worried they're going to be crazy." It's like I wasn't even given that choice. It's like, no, I'm coming through. You can help follow or get out of the way.
Yeah.
So the first, I'd say after a few days of really thinking hard on this and realizing, it wasn't that it was a real experience. Um, I had, three shifts of nurses, right? Morning, afternoon, and night. And the morning team was the real A team. They were great. And there was this one particular one named Jen. And I know she just sometimes seemed to be taking her time in my room, like she liked hanging out because we would talk about all sorts of things. And I said, "Hey, do you mind if I just share this thing with you that's going on in my head?" And she said, "Oh, no." And so I told her about my NDE. And she said, she started crying. I said, "Why are you crying?" She says, "Because I don't want you to die." And
Mm.
I said, "Well, you're in a hospital." And she goes, "Yeah, but you're magical." I said, "How am I magical?" She said, "Well, you know how doctors are so busy. As a patient, you might only get like 15 minutes of their time a day." She said, "For some reason, you have 3 to 5 doctors in here for like an hour and a half, and y'all are talking about anything but your case. And I know because I walk by the door and I snoop, and that's what y'all are doing." And she
Mm.
said, "I've never seen anything like that." Well, to me, that was a clue because you know how a lot of people come back from the other side. And if they, as PMH Atwater says, if they weren't psychic before, they are now. And if they were psychic, they're more so now, right?
Mm.
Well, my thing was not going to be, talking to dead people or telling the future or anything. It was more human and connected than that. I think it was empathy. And I think also as again, post-apocalyptic and gothic, the place looked like where I went to, it was still a higher vibration than here.
Mm.
So it's just natural that you carry some of that aroma or aura or vibration with you when you come back. And people can feel it and they're affected by it. And they want to be around you, or they feel good when they're with you. Or like I said, they don't want you to die. So they start crying. Really interesting. So, but all in all, I was in the hospital for 7 weeks and then I went home and, you know, had the wheelchair, I had the walker, had to butt hop up the stairs to the bench in the shower. It was a fun few weeks. I lost a lot of weight, and still kind of weak and beat up. Went to physical therapy and all that, but it was really interesting how soon after going home, I really needed to know what was the experience I had. I still didn't know it was by definition a near-death experience.
Mhm.
I'd heard of near-death experiences. I was being spiritual and studying all the traditions. I certainly was familiar about out-of-body experiences or meditative practices that lead to going to higher planes. I mean, all this I was very, very conversant with. But because of where the in-between, what it looked like, this, I don't want to say hellish landscape, but it wasn't like, fun. I
Mhm.
thought, did I go to purgatory? And then I did some research and realized purgatory was a concept that really kind of came into existence around the 1200s. I said, no, 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 this was, more timeless than that. It wasn't like a brand new cooked up thing. However, I do think it was created in that moment I was there for me
Mhm.
because that's what would speak to me. The
Mhm.
gears might have something to do with it. This guy likes to build airplanes. Let's show him some gears. I don't know. You see what I'm saying? For someone else, it could have been like being in a beautiful garden and the bad gears that hurt me would appear as weeds to them.
Right.
And they have to remove the weeds to make the garden beautiful. I was removing bad choices in my future, kind of stacking the deck for the rest of my life to remove bad choices that the pain I was able to feel before I had done it, because that's the pain everyone else was going to be caused as well.
Mhm.
So while they were in a state of probability, they could be removed. And think about it. I mean, a past life review, all right, but it's in the past, can't change anything. I know it can be non-judgmental, but you could say, well, here's where I could have done better, or here's where I did well. But if you take the actionable intelligence from a past life, from a life review, and you turn it around to look at what choices those past actions have left you, that could either perpetuate pain or could be a turning point for a better spiritual evolution. Well, isn't that more worth your time? I can't do anything about the past, but I can do something about my future. And
Mhm.
if I'm shown those choices and I'm shown the pain those bad choices could make, even if they don't necessarily look bad from the outside, like winning the lottery, but it doesn't show you being a big jerk after that, then I think that's a much better use of what limited time you have in the other plane, in the higher planes, than just reviewing what I've already done and what I already know. Show me
Well,
something I don't know.
first of all, thank you so much for sharing it. Based around what you just said, there's so many things, so many directions. I just need to
Yeah,
get off my chest right away. So, the first question I would have to you is, did you feel that this near-death experience was necessary for your spiritual and personal growth?
absolutely. Here's the way I characterized it. If we, say we're looking at a person, and we're studying their life and they had a near death experience, right? Looking at it from the outside, having that plane crash or somebody falling downstairs or, being in a rafting accident and they drowned or, anything that causes someone to go under and have a near death experience could look like a somewhat random event. Oh, his plane engine quit, they crashed, or oh, they stepped out in front of a car and they never do that, but or they fell down the icy stairs or something like that. Could look random. But I think if you could really, as you were doing in trying to track back to my childhood, the path forward toward my NDE, I think if you could do that, and I think that's what you're doing, I think you could see where that what appears to be a random event becomes the most next logical step in that person's spiritual evolution. And it is a quantum leap. And those quantum jumps, like in chemistry, mean like when an electron pops out of its orbital into a higher orbital, and there's this big energy release and all this stuff. That's exactly it. That is a
Hmm.
great analogy to describe that bumping out of your orbit of comfort into this new orbit of ambiguity where you don't know what anything means. You just know that when you come back, you're not the same.
It's actually quite amazing when, so I feel blessed that I get to speak to so many people who have had these experiences because, so I coach for a living. I coach a lot of musicians. I also coach people in spiritual work and things like that. And what I notice is, and this is just a categorization that I've created in my own work, is that I put people in pretty much two different categories. And one is the feeler type and one is the thinker type. And the reason I do that is because it helps me when I'm teaching music. It helps me coach them in the direction that best suits their needs, the way that they go. I look at you, and I'm sure you're a feeler at times, but I look at you like a thinker. You remind me of someone like Evan Alexander, who I interviewed not long ago. He's the brain surgeon type person. You
I
guys,
totally know, Evan.
yeah.
Yeah.
So your personality traits, I mean, look at the things you were into, building airplanes. A feeler generally isn't building airplanes. I'm just being honest with you. So I look at that and then I hear your experience
Mm.
and I can see why your experience was built the way it was because it
Yeah.
made perfect sense to you. Yet at a deep level, you're exactly right. It's hitting on many of the same categories that someone who's a feeler who's sitting in a large forest with and seeing these different parts to them that they have to, maybe like you said, the weeds or that whatever they're dealing with. And it's just really interesting hearing the way that you were able to go in and you're resetting these gears. The thing that got me a little bit is you had mentioned that the memory of you, the memory of like your human incarnation right now of Jim's life wasn't completely, you were kind of like, what's Earth? But then yet you mentioned that, and maybe you can clarify this. You mentioned that there was times where, you saw a future event of your daughter.
I know exactly what you're going to ask. And I love it because the gift of the near death experience allows you to split hairs like you never could before. The way
Mhm.
I would answer it is this. Yes, the past is dust, but we live with its consequences.
Hmm.
Remember, the consequence was the choice that is in the future. And that's why it appeared as not as a memory that I forgot, but as a future that had yet to come.
Hmm.
You see?
So your memory was more imprinted in the future rather than the past of the
There was no
Earth.
past, right? Past
Right,
is dust. So
right,
the only thing remaining were again, not the past itself, but the consequences of the past. What remained to me in the future as a result of the choices I made in the past that I have forgotten and don't need to know.
mm-hmm.
The choices that remain are the ones that presented themselves to me. And as I looked at each video, each gear, I could see a video feed and I understood what I was seeing. So when I saw one that showed my daughter, I knew that's my daughter. Well, if we've all been incarnated a million times, we've all had a million daughters,
Right,
right?
right.
But I knew that's my daughter. And but as soon as I looked away to a different gear, that was gone. That was forgotten. But while I looked at it, I understood. Does that help?
So your focus, what you were focusing on in that present moment, had a memory to it. But once the focus shifted, that piece of it was no longer.
Yeah. Well, it's
Yeah.
like saying each gear and each video feed was a mini story, right?
Hmm.
You don't really even have to know anything about it you don't have to know anything about a movie to go see a movie,
Right.
right? And in it, you'll look for the internal logical consistency. You'll look for the relationships. You'll look for cause and effect and continuity and things like that. But you don't have to know anything about it. And when you walk out and go see a different movie, you essentially may forget that movie. Like when you change
Right.
channels on TV, as soon as you change to like if you get bored and change channels to another program, how much are you thinking about the program you just left?
Right.
Not much.
And I absolutely I understand what you're saying, and it makes sense. Like I can put my mind around it with the amount of people I've spoke with that have given similar testimonies. Where I would say is and I like to clarify this for audience members and people have lost loved ones. I'm sure they would love to think that their loved ones are thinking of them at times and that they're not just forgotten. I don't know exactly if it was just in that moment in the in between of where you were, where that was happening, or if there is a choice when you're over there to have those memories or connections with your loved ones, because your
I've
loved
wondered
ones,
about
yeah.
I've wondered about that because how much of what people really desperately need to hear is that my husband died or my wife died, and but they're waiting for me on the other side, or my child died. I'm going to be reunited with them one day.
Hmm.
For me, nope. I'm not saying it's not true, but I do have a question about all that. Um, and so for me, it didn't matter if anybody was waiting for me or not, because I probably would I might not have known who the hell they were.
Right.
And I'm pretty much a solitary. I'm a loner. I'm an INFJ on the Myers-Briggs thing, and I'm really okay riding solo. I mean, I live out here in the Mojave Desert all by myself because I can live a very spiritual life this way.
Hmm.
Okay, here's a question. Um, I mean, if we don't get too much into multiverse theory and bilocation of spirits and things like that, and just sort of take it linearly because we're in the human construct right now. If I were to go to the other side and I saw my parents waiting for me, I'd be real tempted to say, "Did you not have anything else better to do than sit here and wait for me to show up?" I mean, what about your own spiritual evolution? Everybody talks about, oh, you're here, you're here. Then you go back up, you rejoin with your soul group, you sort of have a astral pizza and beer and talk about how you all, messed with each other in this life, and now you're going to plan out your next move. At what point does somebody put their beer down and say, I'll be right back? Because they got to go meet how many descendants that have now died, and they got to go meet them at the pearly gates. You see
Hmm.
what I'm saying? It just sounds a little weird. But I could ask this. You will hear many stories, NDE stories about people being on the other side, and they're just like they are going through the tunnel, or they are going through these incredibly beautiful realms, and they will meet helper spirits aplenty. There are many spirits there that seem helpful. They'll show them around, they'll answer questions, they'll take them to another place they want them to see. How do we know that when we go to the other side, there aren't helper spirits to receive us to say, hey, stop hyperventilating, come off the ledge. You're still alive, you just don't have a body. Don't panic. And we project on them in our desperation to deal with this ambiguity called death. We
Hmm.
project on them something that would be comfortingly familiar,
Hmm.
like our grandma, our grandpa, or who Fluffy, or whoever, something that is familiar to us and gave us comfort in this life. You generally don't hear about people going over there and the ancestor they meet is somebody who beat the crap out of them when they were a little kid or abused them in some way. Usually it's a comforting presence. I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if, because look, how do we know that what my experience was compared to somebody who could theoretically have a very similar in terms of the mechanics of it experience? But like I said, it's the garden with weeds and mine's the egg with gears. How do we know that wasn't because that's what I projected upon it?
Right.
I
Well,
needed somebody to explain it to me in very concrete machine terms.
mhm.
you
No,
know,
I, yeah.
and it worked. Tailor the message to the audience, right? So how would that be different than if I came over the other side and I was a little discombobulated and these helper spirits were there and I projected on them my grandmother who was a very spiritual person? It'd be, I think, totally within reason, as much as anything else could be said to be within
Hmm.
reason.
Hmm.
And I say that because, I mean, by the time I go to the other side, is it not possible that my parents would have reincarnated here?
Yes.
And I mean, they're working on their own stuff. They got their own eggs to crack open and gears to move around,
Hmm.
Why,
I think you're
and that
touching.
relationship also ends after here.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I think you're touching on a few things that kind of mesh together. However, this is just my own personal thought, my own personal feeling from people I've spoke with, is that yes, so I completely agree with the comforting aspect of it. I also agree that other spirits could likely look or manipulate themselves to look like someone who's comforting to you. I absolutely agree with that. Also spoke with many people who go to the other side and they're ready to see their mother and father, and it ends up being their third cousin they never met that ended up dying early in life.
Yeah.
And they're like, "What are you doing here? Like, why am I meeting you here?" Right? Um, and I think that that's really fascinating. I don't think it actually takes away that they're not, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is at the same time, I think we have a higher self and we have this self, right? And the higher self is likely doing all kinds of things, whether they're reincarnating, all these things. And there's at times there may be a way for them to reincarnate, but also be there at the same time. I would put that out there.
It could be. And that I mentioned that at the very beginning, whether we call it
Mhm.
bilocation or the multiverse theory
Yeah.
or just this is what it means as a this is the kind of power that's inherent in a term called child of God.
Right,
That
right.
you really can be living out all these different lifetimes simultaneously,
Hmm.
where you can just be in so many places because there's plenty of us to go around that way. And that could be true. All I'm saying is I'm looking at it a little more analytically to
Hmm.
understand it, since it is something that, as you have said, comes up so often.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I,
since my experience was absolutely counter to it, meaning when I left, as far as I know, when I left here, I left my gender at the door. I left my race at the door. I left my relationships at the door. And there was nothing to take over to the other side, whether it's gold or wives or husbands or children or money or all that stuff. All that was wiped clean.
I think that's partially why I love your story because that's what it teaches people. If you are living your entire life just based around that, to
Mhm.
realize that you had this experience that was secluded in a completely different place. I do believe there's different layers to this. I've talked to people who've had a very just a quick, brisk experience. I've had other people wake up and they have a sheet over them and they're tagged and they're ready to go and they're like what happened, and they might have had a deeper experience. I'm not saying your experience wasn't as deep, but for you it could have been kind of you said it many times, an in between. It was like an in between place that
Yeah.
but it did also show you that the you that is exists beyond this, it seems.
Oh, yeah,
And
for
I'm sure
sure.
without a shadow of a doubt, you now feel that, and you did feel that after the accident.
Well, I always believed it, but this really put a sharp point on it. It really did.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was really no question about it after that. And to the point that one time when I lived, this was when I lived in Connecticut. So I was visiting a friend in New York who had over for a visit a friend who was the vice president of the American Psychical Association that the psychologist William Henry founded, I think, in 1888. Yeah, I think that's correct. Or William James. His name is William James, sorry. And so she asked me, she said, well, on the day you were, going to fly your plane and all this happened, did you have a bad premonition while you were doing your pre-flight? And I said, that's a perfect question to come from you. I said, but as you ask the question, I feel my NDE. I can feel the in between. If you'll kind of well up inside me and say it this way, forget premonition. Imagine I was hit with full foreknowledge of what was getting ready to happen. You're going to get in this plane, you're going to go flat, you're going to crash, and you're going to have a near death experience. You're going to be really beat up. But I've had the guts to get into the cockpit anyway. Because if God
Yeah.
says, I need a little one on one time with you, do you think you're saying no?
Right. Especially if you know without a shadow of a doubt that that is from God and that you want to spend that moment.
Could you
Absolutely.
walk into that?
Yeah.
That's a hard question, isn't it? But
Yeah.
just that you can ask that question sometimes is enough. I
Mhm.
have faced some other things since then that people could say, well, that was kind of like getting into a cockpit of an airplane that was going to crash. And I say, yeah. And they said, what was different this time? I said that I knew it. And I knew I needed to go through that. I needed to go through that experience, and I needed to learn what it was going to teach me.
Right.
And uh, and also, I needed to see how detached I really am from that depersonalization I had, um, in terms of being able to leave things behind.
Hmm.
And that's been a a marvelous revelation. Because you're detached doesn't mean you don't care. Just my first book was about my life before the NDE, and then coming to grips with it or starting to afterwards, thinking about things in a different way.
Right.
And then a lot of people say, well, how do we put this into practice? So I wrote the second book called The Practice in Between, The Art of Letting Go. And both these books are on Amazon, and I narrate the Audible book as well. Now I'm trying to sell books. I give them away a lot more than I sell. We leave them out in the desert for people to find, and they
Oh,
disappear.
nice.
They disappear real quickly. And I get some interesting emails afterwards. Yeah. Um, but it's really just been a continuing magical path full of synchronicities. And it really, if somebody say, okay, so what's your new spiritual path or revised or whatever, I'd say it's really, really, really more and more about letting go, about doing less than doing more. You don't need to chase the next thing to be the next big thing. You really don't. You have it already in you. When you hold a baby, you're holding someone who has all the secrets to the universe. They've got everything they need to know to be a happy spiritual being. It's like between society and puberty, that's where they get messed up. But right.
Very
But
true.
anyway, as anybody who's ever had a teenager could tell you. But really, it's important to just really let go and just don't try to control things so much. Just really take sort of a more Eastern approach. One time when I was in Africa, I was talking to a Kalahari Bushman, the legendary trackers. They could track people over rock. And he said to me, he said, sometimes the best way to hunt is to sit and wait. There you
Hmm.
go. So
Hmm.
it's not saying, don't just stand there, do something. It's saying, don't just do something, stand there.
Right. Right. Wow.
Sometimes the best way to do it is just to let things unfold. And I think when we initiate things from intention more than desire, we have a chance of that happening. And by that, there's a subtle truth that kind of sums it all up, and that's this. This is my belief anyway, that nothing was put here solely for your enjoyment. It was put here for your best use. And it is in its best use we find joy.
Hmm.
Imagine applying that to your relationships, to just pretty much anything, you know?
Hmm.
Kind of keeps the cart and the horse in the right place.
One thing that I thought was really interesting about when you were explaining when you came back, you said it was kind of like this, you're coming back. I don't know why I felt this when you mentioned it, but it felt like, because you said, oh, here I am in the hospital, right? And I don't know why it felt like this, but the way that you explained it, it made me feel like you felt kind of an actor of a play and you're back in the act.
Pretty much. And that does speak to a lot of things, like are we here just basically reading from a script and playing a character? And if so, it's interesting to say, well, then that means there's no free will, and say, yeah, well, if you're an actor reading, playing according to a script, yeah, you're not there to demonstrate your free will. You're there to act out a script. And you could say it's because you're supposed to learn lessons. I kind of have a problem with some of this though, because think about it. If the idea is that what we're yearning for is to return to our spiritual home,
Mhm.
and you believe in reincarnation, I mean, this is a lot of assumptions, right? But you put things together as best you can. And that would be okay. So didn't I have a first incarnation here at one time? Maybe it was back in the dinosaurs. Maybe it was when Mars had air and water. I don't know. But the bottom line is this. Wasn't there a time when I was fresh out of heaven and here? Well, when will I ever be that holy again?
Mm.
And now you're
Mhm.
telling me I have to learn stuff like how to be nice to people. When at one time I came out of perfection itself, and I was first born here. What is there for me to learn if I have already come from that? And that's my true home. I don't
Mhm.
get that. You know,
Mhm.
so I really don't quite buy into a lot of what people talk about. Like the whole soul group thing. Like, Like people in this life who may be terrified of the water because they drowned, they fell off the Mayflower in 1620s or something like this, you know. So I can't believe that if we're this soul group and we're all hanging out to help enlighten each other and grow, that we're traumatizing the hell out of each other with traumas that can carry across lifetimes, preventing you from having trust and love and all this other magical, touchy-feely, huggy stuff that's supposed to grow you spiritually. I don't buy it. I
Mm.
really don't buy that.
Yeah, and a lot of these are I would say though that, one of the best answers a lot of people will say is that we're here to experience, right? So if we're here to experience, if that's
I do
simply
agree.
what it is, instead of just a uh, spiritual growth, and again, I'm not saying anything right here. I take everybody's experiences and I feel those experiences and then I come with my own conclusion, right? That's what we're meant to do here. But when I hear someone say, "Yeah, we're here simply for the experience," that's it.
I could agree with that because think about it. Certainly, okay, the higher planes are called the sublime for a reason. They're very much more subtle. Like you were talking about the person who thinks or the person who feels. Well, logic tells us what should be correct. Emotions tell us what's important. And beyond that, we have what we call vibration.
Hmm.
That has nothing to do really with feeling or thinking. It's just you walk into a room, you look at somebody, and you either say, "Oh God, I feel like I've known them for all my life," or "I've got to get away from that person at all costs." Don't know why. Just the vibe is all wrong, right? And we
Right.
need to pay attention to that. But part of what I want to back into your question with this is so the sublime planes mean they're really subtle. You know, like if I gave you a plate of sublime food, you'd probably say it doesn't have any flavor, right? Well, maybe you just need to kind of develop your sense of taste a little more for those subtle flavors, right?
Hmm.
So, okay, but this is definitely the plane of intensity. I
Mm.
don't know how it gets more intense than this place, you
Yeah.
know? I
Yeah.
mean, there is a story one time about a guy who could meditate so well that when he meditated, he went out of his body, he went to the higher plane. One day, he went to a plane that you could say looked a lot like hell. He's standing up on a cliff. He's looking down upon the plains below. Everything's kind of reddish and dusky and smoky, and all these little tiny fires are out there on the plain. And then he happens to know, I'll just call him the Lord of that realm, was standing next to him, also taking in the view. And the guy said, "Hey, what are all the little fires?" And the Lord of that realm said, "Those are all the individual souls in torment." And he goes, He goes, "I guess you stay pretty busy." And the Lord of the realm said, "What do you mean?" He goes, keeping those fires going." And the Lord of the realm said, "You don't understand. They bring the fires themselves."
Hmm.
How many people do you know aren't happy unless they're miserable about something?
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah.
We go where we vibe,
Hmm.
you know?
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
then when we're tired of vibing that way, we look up and we say, I think I'm ready to go now and leave this vibratory place. And that can
Right.
happen here when you suddenly say, "You know what? I'm tired of being poor. I'm tired of being broke. I'm tired of feeling unfulfilled. At the risk of losing everything, I'm going to go and try to do something about it." And that's when the magic starts to happen. Now, there's an old talking about letting go. There's this old saying that you know what a samurai is with the sword,
Yep.
right? That on the field of battle, when a samurai draws his sword, but he throws away his scabbard, it's because he'll never need it again. On this day, he's free.
Mm.
This is how we should live our lives every single moment with that much surrender to the will, with that much abandon. Like when you see those surfers surfing those 100-foot waves off Portugal, holy cow. Do you think they're worried about where they just went and where they're going? No, they got to be in the moment, just stay on the board. The ocean will
Yeah.
take them where they're supposed to go. That's how I would say that photograph totally represents to me how we should live our lives every single moment, no matter what we do. Sleep on the floor, taking the kids shopping,
Hmm.
whatever,
That's the
surfing the
space.
wave.
That's the space I try to get my musicians with too, is they
It's
can't,
flow.
because what is in the flow? The moment they start to think, that's when I notice panic, or they stop, or they're thinking too much about what's coming, what chord, or And I'm like,
Yeah,
that's where you go wrong. You have to
exactly.
be in the flow. Or as I sometimes I used to see it more like unconscious. I've had moments doing shows where I would do shows and the next thing you know, everyone's clapping or something, and I go, "Oh, what?" Like I forgot even what song I just did, and I'm like, "Is my brain okay?" No, I was just so deep in that moment that I lost track of the fact that I was performing. Like I still remembered the performance. It was just forgot my surroundings, if that makes sense. And that's the
So
place. That's the place to be, right? So no, this has been amazing. Your ideologies are very different based on your experience, but at the same time, there's carryover. Like I've said, I think any of us really, even NDEers or anyone in the spiritual realm of things, would be completely naive to think that we have it all figured out. We're all trying to piece it together and we feel what's right and wrong. Some people have brought up the idea that we have, like you said, layers. Possibly when we leave this realm, we have different, there's layers to where we are, where you were may have been in a different layer, or I should say, vibratory state, like you said.
certainly,
And the higher you go up, maybe you can access completely different things that we wouldn't be able to comprehend because our mind wouldn't even understand it. And so, but I understand also the things you brought up today that are a little bit different. The ideas of I'm not completely against soul groups and all these different things, but I know where there's sometimes you'll hear one thing and it kind of contradicts the other, and you go, what is that? If it, and that's where
yeah,
a lot of the questions start to arise. So, for anyone who wants to connect with you, you said you had two books, I believe, or you might have
yeah.
more.
The first one, it's on Amazon. You can also go to my website. It's inbetweenproductions with an S.com, inbetweenproductions.com. And you can read through that. You'll see the books there and just click on it and go to Amazon. You'll also see, the conversation I had with the NDE. Um, and the books are titled, the first one is The In Between, A Trip of a Lifetime. I could have called it Back by Popular Demand, but you do
That's
get a
pretty
sense
good.
of humor every
Yeah,
now
yeah,
and
yeah.
then. But this was The In Between, A Trip of a Lifetime. And the second one was The Practice in Between, The Art of Letting Go.
Okay. Okay. And they can be both found the inbetweenproductions.com, your main website. That's great. Perfect. Appreciate everything you've shared today. I always ask everybody this final question. It's we've really talked about it a lot, so you can say what you'd like about it, but I said
This is
something.
great. I really enjoyed talking with you. Like you said, it's very, very conversational and just, like two guys having pizzas and beer or whatever.
Absolutely, it's kind of what I wanted in the Soul Inspired is to just kind of have conversation come up to allow other people's minds to just to think for themselves, to come up with their own conclusions, what we feel. And if I said to you, why, if there is this other realm, these other realms, whatever it may be, our higher self, if they exist. What is your reasoning to think why we come here and become this avatar suit actor?
Along my way, like I said, growing up and looking for answers in all the wrong places, um, I follow an Eastern path. And I was made to wait 23 years before they would take me in. I had to live as if I were living on that path for those 23 years. And then on the day they initiated me into that path, I said, "Why the wait?" And they said, "We don't seek to increase our numbers. You don't need to send us any money. You don't need to call us by any honorific. You don't need to recognize us on the street. You know what you need to do now to get out of the cycles of reincarnation that chain you here and go home." And that's my goal, is to not reincarnate anymore. So following that tradition, their explanation is we were sent here. And um, all I can say is, there's a book written by the mystic Kabir, Kabir, called The Anurag Sagar, The Ocean of Love. And most of the book is about the creation of the higher planes. And the last part of the book is the, oh yeah, P.S. creation of the Earth plane. And it's amazing. It was epic. It was insanely epic. And so it's kind of a sad story. But the fact is, the boon that God kept from the negative power that, would like to stay here is that he said, should anyone wake up and say, I want to go home, I can come and get them.
Hmm.
So that's the path I finally got back on, and that's totally consistent with the spiritual life I live. It was interesting. I'll leave you with this. When I went down to Charlotte, North Carolina in May of 2022, my mom was in a very, very, very nice old folks home. It was like a country club. And hadn't seen her for a few years because of COVID. They locked it down, obviously, old
Yeah.
people being natural target for COVID. So I'm seeing her after 3 years, and I'm there my first night, and I'm tucking her in, and all of a sudden I saw with a different vision, like probably like I had in between. I saw her face turn purple. I saw these lines appear like creases across her face, and I said, "Oh, that's her." And I'm go into that, non-emotional state, observer. And I said, "Oh, that's her dead. That means she doesn't have much time. It's good I'm here so we can make peace." So I was there at this old folks' home. I actually gave a presentation about my near-death experience because I'm a kind of cheeky bastard anyway, and I just thought it'd be funny to talk to old people whose next stop is death about it. And I think it was pretty well received. About 80 of them came. And then I went home for about 2 weeks, and then I came back to spend the whole summer with her because it was clear she was not doing well. She was 88, bad arthritis, but other stuff, liver, whatever, kidney. Um, on the morning she died of August 3rd, in my morning meditation, I sort of had an out of body experience. It was like reliving a memory with her, well, before we were both born. And so imagine your final planning discussion before you're both going to be born or whatever, right? And she was like really excited about this life we were going to have together. And I literally was kind of like, yeah, whatever. But she was really jazzed about it. And as she was like, you might say, looking at the map of our life, her milestones were not, oh, you're going to go to Mount Everest. Oh, you're going to go to war. Oh, you're going to do this. Oh, you're going to do that. No, 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 no. Her milestones were the emotions we were going to experience together as mother and son. That's
Oh,
what she was going for. That's what made this trip important to her. She wanted to experience the kinds of emotions only maybe a physical mom can feel for a physical child on a physical plane. That was her whole ticket. That was her ticket to Disney World to come and have that experience. And as I woke up or came out of that, I said, mission accomplished, Mom. Well done. And that's the day she died. She could finally go now.
wow.
We felt the last emotion that we needed to from the beginning to the end.
That's a huge piece. Hopefully, are you okay me sharing that in the show as well?
Yeah,
Because that's a
by all
piece.
means.
That's an amazing story.
Isn't that
And you
beautiful?
had that it's almost like a shared life review experience then
Yeah,
with
I
her. Is
guess
that
it
what it
kind of
was like?
was, or a pre-life review. It was
Hmm.
but it
Oh,
was
right. Pre-life,
by the
right.
grace of God, it was just such a nice way for her to go out.
Hmm.
It was a nice kind of send off.
Yeah.
A quick say, "Hey, Mom, we hit it. We did it. We hit all those things.
Right,
We're
right,
Yeah, go and do what you got to do.
right.
We've got this here. We'll be fine."
Amazing. I
All
appreciate
right,
you taking
buddy.
the time today. This has been a really nice conversation. I always turn to the audience, say, please continue to like, share, and subscribe to the Soul Inspired so I continue to get amazing guests like Jim on. Please go to his website if you're interested in the work that he's done, the books that he's put out. But thank you so much, Jim, for coming on. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe, to you and your viewers. It's nice spending some time with you. And hey, let's do it again sometime. So